Hello, thank you for joining us for our Bible study at Epiphany of Christ Lutheran Church in Apache Junction, Arizona. I'm Pastor Steve Crittenden, and so glad that you joined us as we look at our third session on the subject of heaven. And I want to go back just a little bit and remind those of you who were part of the Bible study when we began looking at heaven and hell, and we talked about this really important concept for so many people of reward and punishment. And one of the things that we did as we looked at the Old Testament readings and the scriptures, the holy writings of the Old Testament, that we couldn't find any place that was the punishment of those who had done wrong after they had died. So we couldn't find a place where if somebody displeased God, God sent them to this place for punishment. We didn't find that. What of course we found was the Hebrew conception of Sheol, the place where the dead go, but there really wasn't much description of that. But that began to change as God's people suffered through a couple of exiles. And in the exiles, God's people were taken from their land and spread across the empire. And as that was happening, they were being exposed to other teachings, to teachings that were very different from their own, different ways of looking at the world. Primarily, they were being introduced to Greek philosophy and to Greek mythology. And in that, of course, then the introduction of Hades, the god or the person who is the head of the place where the dead go, and that place was also called Hades. So in our New Testament, one of the words that's translated as hell so often is the word Hades, which is a reference to Greek mythology. But there is one particular writing from our Old Testament that is often used as a verse that gives support to the notion that there is a place where the evil go, where God sends evil people. And we find it in the book of Daniel. We find it in the 12th chapter, and it is verse 2. And I want you to listen to what it says. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So as I said, we often find this as a verse that's used to support the notion that if you displease God, when you die, you're going to go to hell, this place of eternal contempt. I want to talk to you a little bit here about the interpretation and the reading of texts. And it doesn't matter whether it is the Old Testament, the New Testament, doesn't matter whether it's a religious text, whether it's Harry Potter or Stephen King or a letter from your grandma. There is some way that you have to be able to get meaning out of that text. And one of the ways that we do that, one of the ways that we interpret text uses a couple of kind of fancy sounding words. And essentially it's this. If when you come to the text, you bring your own meaning and you sort of subject the text to the meaning that you already bring to it, that's called eisegesis. That's called bringing the meaning into the text. But if instead you read the text in order to get meaning out of the text, that's called exegesis. And what we see is that if we look at that verse that I just read to you, and I want to let you know that I'm not taking that verse out of its context. So I invite you to read what's around chapter 11 and 12 of Daniel, and you'll see that I'm not taking it out of context. But when we read that verse, if we come to the conclusion, reading that verse, that hell is a place that God sends us when we die after having displeased God, that can only happen through eisegesis. That can only happen through the process of bringing meaning there. And we'll take a look at this really quickly in order to see that. what we need to do in order to get a meaning out of a text is we need to let that text live in its context, live in its situation. So we need to know what the situation is for the author, for Daniel. We need to know what the situation is for Daniel's original readers. We need to know how that verse in this situation sits among the verses around it. And so one of the things that we know is that Daniel is one of the last, if not the last, books of the Old Testament to have been written. It certainly was compiled in part during the time of the Exodus, about 500 years before Jesus, 500 to 700 years roughly. But we also know that its final composition occurred no more than about 170 years before Jesus. And the way we know that is this. Going back maybe a year or so, you might remember that in the Bible study I had given out a sheet that sort of listed the different empires that had control over Judah and Palestine. One of those empires that was late was the Seleucid Empire, the Greek Empire. And during the time of the Greek Empire, Jews pretty much had things going pretty well for them. The empire was leaving them alone. They were free to do what they wanted to do in Jerusalem and in Judea. The Jews that were spread around the empire were pretty much hassle-free, allowed to live their faith and live their lives without being harassed by the empire. But that all changed when Emperor Antiochus IV came into power. Antiochus IV then began to persecute the Jews. And we saw that happen throughout the empire, and we saw that happen even in Jerusalem and throughout Judea. And as a result of this harassment, as a result of this very severe persecution, some Jews put an army together to revolt against the Seleucid Empire. And there was one family in particular that was behind that move called the Maccabeans. And so this is often called the Maccabean Revolt. And they actually were fairly successful. They had some success. In fact, they drove the empire out of Jerusalem and out of the immediate area. And what that did is it allowed them to repair the temple, to rededicate the temple. The temple had been used to worship and make sacrifice to foreign deities, to pagan gods, and now they were able to fix things up and to rededicate it to Yahweh, rededicate it to the God of the people. We read about this in the Apocrypha books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and one of the things that happened is that, of course, it was dark inside. They needed to have lights lit, but they didn't want to, in their rededication, defile and pollute the area by using oil that had been used for worship of other gods. And so they kept looking around for good, pure oil. And they finally found one jug of oil. They knew that it was pure because it was still sealed. And they unsealed it, they opened it, they put it in the lamps. It had enough oil for one day. And through a miracle of God, the lamps continued to burn for 8 days and 8 nights. And of course, that is the story behind the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. It is out of this context that this writing from Daniel comes. It is during this period that Daniel is writing about what we just read, that many who are now asleep in the dust of the earth will rise, some to everlasting life and others to everlasting contempt. If we are going to make the conclusion that this is talking about heaven, then we can only make that conclusion, heaven and hell, I should say, we can only make that conclusion by bringing that meaning in to it, because there's nothing in the words, the verse that we read that says that, and there's nothing in the context of what's happening that would give that would offer the meaning that what this is describing is a resurrection of the dead where some go to heaven and some go to hell. In fact, what Daniel is talking about is that there will be a resurrection, and in the time of the resurrection, as reminding you what it says, is that many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So this is clearly talking about resurrection. But what it's actually talking about is that some are going to rise who are currently dead, and others, they're going to be resurrected, but they're going to be resurrected, have everlasting life in a new kingdom on earth that will be established by the Messiah. That's the context out of which this is talking. But it's not talking about going to heaven, being resurrected and going to heaven, or being resurrected and going to hell. In fact, what it's talking about is that there are the righteous people and there are the wicked people. The righteous people are going to be raised to everlasting life, and the wicked are going to be raised to shame and everlasting contempt. This is talking about justice. This is talking about God's justice, and those who are the righteous are understood to be those who died protecting God and God's people, who died for the sake of God and God's people. Martyrs are what we're talking about here. Those who are going to be resurrected to shame and everlasting contempt, the wicked, are those who killed the martyrs. And so what we're talking about here in terms of justice is that it was absolutely, from God's perspective, unjust that these martyrs should die, that these people should die for the sake of God and God's people. At the same time, it's unjust that those who killed the martyrs should have died never having been punished for what they did. And so what this talks about is a resurrection that makes just the death of the martyrs. So now not only are they no longer dead, they'll never die, they will have everlasting life. It also is just in that there will be a resurrection of the wicked, so that they then can have the punishment on earth in this kingdom that the Messiah is establishing. They now, who died before they had the chance to be punished, now are going to be resurrected. They're going to live again so that they can feel the punishment that they deserve for having killed the martyrs. So one of the things that happens when we practice eisegesis, when we bring meanings in, is that we act as though the reading has words in it that it doesn't have, and we ignore the words that are in there. And so therefore we don't get the correct meaning out of it. So for example, there is no mention of heaven in here, and there's no mention of hell. And so we can only make those conclusions if we bring that meaning into it and impose it on the text. At the same time, if we think that this gives support for a universal resurrection, then we can only make that conclusion if we ignore words that are in the reading. So I want you to listen again to the reading and see if you catch what it is that I'm talking about. Again, this is Daniel 12, verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. The important words here that point to this not being a universal resurrection, a resurrection of all of the dead, some to heaven and some to hell, are the very first words in the reading, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth. Not all of those who sleep. It's talking here about the martyrs and the people who killed the martyrs. Everybody else just simply stays dead. And so even though this is often used to support the punishment and reward notion of heaven and hell, it actually is support for the notion of the existence of the resurrection. I think it gets the resurrection wrong a little bit, but it does give us Old Testament scriptural support for the idea of a resurrection. Now, this is from the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. This book is included in the group called the Writings, which means that it's not part of the Torah. And if it's not part of the Torah, that means that the Sadducees don't study this book. They don't study, they don't read, they don't find it to be instructive for them. And that's one of the reasons why the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in life after death because they don't, Daniel is among the books that they don't read. Now I want us to come forward and consider what Jesus had said on the subject. And particularly, what I want to do is begin at the start of John's Gospel. You hear me say this so often. First of all, it's just very beautiful, but also it's explaining to us what the incarnation story is about. And I'm talking about John 1:1 and then John 1:14. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. Jesus is God taking on flesh, coming from heaven to earth in order to live among us. Jesus is revealing God to us. Anything that we think we understand about God that is different than what we hear from Jesus and what we see Jesus do is incorrect. Jesus is the full revelation of God. And I want to remind you about at the end of Jesus's life, when Jesus is on the cross, he's got bandits on either side of him. And in the 23rd chapter of Luke, we read that the two bandits are kind of sniping at each other. They're arguing with one another. The one tells Jesus, if you're really all this big a deal, get us out of this thing. And the other one says, don't you have any respect for this holy person? And Jesus turns to that bandit and says, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. And that's a great verse of wonderful comfort for me and for others. But this is again an example where an opportunity for us to look at the interpretation of text, because there's an editorial choice that has to be made in the translation of that sentence. And here's where that's coming from. In the Hebrew of the Old Testament, the Greek of the New Testament, there are no punctuation marks. So every single punctuation mark that you see in your English translation of Scripture, no matter which translation you have, every single punctuation mark is a choice that's made by some editor. Because there are none in the original. Now, these are theologians that are making this. Unlike the chapter and verse numbers, these are theologians that are making these editorial choices. And there can be meaning that is changed based on that. So when you just heard me read from Luke 23, this is verse 43, truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. What I want you to do is understand that there's an editorial choice about where we put that comma, and it changes the meaning of the sentence. If we put the comma before the word today, then the word today modifies everything that comes after it. If we put the comma after the word today, then the word today modifies or attaches to everything that comes before it. So I want you to listen to this. I'm going to read this now as though the comma came after the word today. This would be have Jesus saying to that bandit, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." Now listen to how the meaning can change if we move that comma to being before the word today. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. In the second one, today is saying when the bandit will be with Jesus in paradise, it will be today. In the first way that we did it, with the comma coming after the word today, it's telling us when Jesus is saying this. Truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. This, while it gives hope that someday that bandit will be in paradise, it doesn't let the bandit be encouraged by when that day is going to be. But the second reading does. Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. That's a different meaning just based on where that comma is. So then, how do we determine where that comma should be? Well, I'll tell you from my perspective, as well as the compilers of the translations, there are about 100 times in Scripture that Jesus uses that phrase, truly I tell you. Almost 100 times Jesus says that, and never once does Jesus modify that with the word today. So if the comma should go after the word today, truly I tell you today, then surely we would have found that in at least some of the other nearly 100 times Jesus uses that phrase, and we don't see it ever being used. And so I think that's really very good support for the idea that what Jesus is telling that bandit is that the very day that the bandit dies, the bandit is going to be with Jesus in paradise. So now we've got to get a sense of what does paradise mean. Paradise is not a Hebrew word. Paradise is not a Greek word. Paradise is not an English word. Paradise is actually a Persian word. So this is a word that God's people were borrowing from one of those empires that had control over them. During the exile, when they were under the control of the Persian Empire, they were exposed to the Persian language and Persian philosophy and worldview, and this is one of the words that they borrowed from the Persians, and that is the word paradise. Excuse me. In Persian, the word paradise means an enclosed garden or orchard. And this is the word that's often used in the Septuagint. It's used for the creation, one of the creation stories in Genesis, for a description of Eden. Eden is described as either a garden or an orchard. I kind of like the idea of the orchard better because there's so much tree language that occurs as opposed to just general garden language. But the idea is that Eden was an enclosed place set off, which is what the word holy means, set off from the rest of creation. And that's where Adam and Eve were with God. And then we have the introduction of sin, and Adam and Eve are sent away from the garden, from the orchard. Now they're outside the enclosure. And they aren't in the perfect paradise with God that God intended them to be. And it wasn't God's doing, it was their doing that happened. We also then later see in the Cain and Abel story the introduction of death. And we see that it continues, the human experience continues down a way that God never intended for that experience to be, with sin and death, with Adam and Eve listening to another voice, the voice of the serpent, listening to another voice instead of God. That was never intended to be. And of course, the the introduction of death in the Cain and Abel story. That too was never meant to be. And I think the reason that these two things end up being introduced into the human experience is because the holiness of God is so great that it confounds us, that it confuses us. We can't get our heads all the way around it, and so we tend then to make some errors. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it doesn't have to stay that way. What we see happen then is that the Creator is no longer in that Eden, but instead goes back to heaven. The Word in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But the incarnation story is God as Jesus coming among God's people to correct the problems that were created by the introduction of sin and death that God had never intended. So that now in heaven, where the Creator resides, we talked about heaven being the dwelling place of God, and we do find in Scripture a case where there are people who are holy enough to be able to go and live with God in heaven. But we find in all the history of people only two examples of people who lived lives so holy that they can be with God in heaven. And that's Enoch and Elijah. And so Jewish tradition says that neither of them died. They ascended to heaven, never having died. But that isn't the case for anybody else. Now, there's Roman Catholic tradition that says that Mary, the mother of Jesus, died and ascended to heaven, having never sinned and therefore being holy, never had to die. And there's also some Jewish tradition that says that Moses, likewise, never died, ascended to heaven. It's a little different than what we read about happening to Moses, but nevertheless, that is a Jewish tradition that is out there. What we see in the existence of heaven is that, and in the story of the incarnation in Jesus Christ, is that God is restoring creation to what God intended it to be. Now, God's not doing this by way of a light switch. One instant creation is corrupt, and the next instant it's no longer corrupt. There's a process going on here. I don't know why God chose to do it as a process, and it's something I'll find out one day. But right now I don't know, but I do know that that's what's happening. And so what we see is that that the resurrection, which we have support for, is something that is universal. And my theology says that there aren't some people who are resurrected from the dead so that God can send them to hell. We find no support for that in any Old Testament writing, and we don't find support for that in New Testament writing either, but we do have support for the notion that people are resurrected after having died. They are resurrected and then they go to heaven. We hear that again in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, when Jesus is telling them that he's going to go back to heaven, and he's telling his disciples that that's a good thing, because if I go, then I go to prepare a place for you. Remember, we talked about this as heaven being a place. If I go to prepare a place for you, then I will return again and take you to the place that I've prepared for you, so that where I am, heaven, you may be also. So this is a restoration of the way things were meant to be. But still, only the righteous go. But what we read in the gospel story is that Jesus is our righteousness. For me to get to heaven, the only way it's going to work for me to get to heaven is that Jesus is holy enough for both of us. The only way for you to get to heaven is that Jesus is holy enough for himself and for you to get to heaven, and that's going to happen. The other is, as we saw from the story of from Daniel, the notion that those who are resurrected are the righteous who were martyrs. Well, you don't have to be the martyr. You don't have to die for God and God's people. Jesus is that martyr. Jesus on the cross is God dying for God and for God's people, being the martyr that then gives us the everlasting life that comes with resurrection. Resurrection to a everlasting life with Jesus in God's dwelling place in heaven that awaits all of us. In our next session, we're going to talk about just what is heaven like? What do we know about what heaven looks like? I sure hope you'll join us for that. But for now, God bless you.